Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first episode of our new Real Talk series, which is where we sit down and have a very candid and honest discussion about some of the underpublicized areas within music and the music industry. More specifically, today we'll be talking about people with disabilities, health conditions, and learning difficulties. And the purpose of this series is kind of to raise awareness for these fields and promote change, and kind of highlighting to everyone how we may help with this on a day-to-day basis. So my name's Carys. I am a second year on the music and sound recording degree, and I'm here today with Lesley, who is the director of Jessies Fund. So if you could, Lesley, just introduce yourself, please, and say a bit about yourself as a musician and also your involvement with the organisation.
So I'm a clarinet player. I live in York. I teach clarinet at the University of York too. For the first half or more than half of my working life, I was a performer playing in quite well-known orchestras and specialising on historical instrument performance. But not only doing that, I also did contemporary music and so on all along as well. And then my life took rather a turn. My 9-year-old daughter became ill and was diagnosed quite quickly with a brain tumour, which was not operable. So she had a period of radiotherapy, which was the only treatment that was possible for her to give her a remission. She did not survive as long as would have enabled us to take her to New York for some treatment, which we'd been hoping to do, and for which our colleagues in the music business had been very generously collecting money. We sat around a kitchen table in our house with some of our colleagues who'd come up from London with the first tranche of money that they'd collected, and we said, well, we'd better find a way of saving this money that wasn't just in a personal bank account. At this stage, Jessie was part of the conversation still. And we tried to think of names for bank account. That was all, just for a bank account, and we were going to spend the money on treatment for her. And she eventually piped up, shall we just call it Jessie's Fund? So that was the beginning of Jessie's Fund. And at that point, I was still a full-time musician for some years to come. But Jessie died less than 6 months after her diagnosis in a children's hospice, at which point your worldview changes and you start to think of music in a different light, or at least I started to think of music in a different light, and that's where Jessie's Fund was born.
Yeah, and it's been on such an incredible journey ever since. I did a lot of reading prior to this interview about the work your group has done, and it's phenomenal. So it was founded in 1995, if I've got that right.
Yeah, we were registered as a charity in
Yeah, and
1995.
it's such a wonderful group of people. So I was wondering if you could tell us kind of a little bit about the journey that it's been on since then.
So Jessie actually died in 1994, and actually, as an aside, just before she died, a couple of months before she died, in a period of remission for her, we'd been in Barcelona. I have to think, where were we at the time? We were in Barcelona playing at the amazing Palau de la Música with John Elliott Gardner and the English Baroque soloists. And we'd been recording Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and the Emperor Piano Concerto. And she'd come with us, and she was sitting there in the audience. She was only 9, but loved music and no problem sitting in hours of concert for her. And then a couple of months later, she died. And in the summer, a couple of months after that, we played in a prom. And one of the pieces we did was Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Like all proms, it was on Radio 3, and we listened back later and were absolutely amazed because actually this prom was dedicated to Jessie. and she was mentioned on the radio, and it was in a way it felt like this was the beginning of Jessie's Fund as the charity, because at that prom there was a collection in aid of Jessie's Fund, raised quite a lot of money.
Wow.
So Jessie's Fund started from the point of view of music as a performance art, but Jessie's Fund isn't about music as performance. It's about music as part of life, really.
Yeah.
So I've slightly digressed. You asked about the journey. So that summer, we played the prom, and a couple of weeks after that, I met with somebody at the children's hospice where Jessie had died. She spent her last few days in a children's hospice.
Yeah.
Whilst we were at that hospice, I just was very aware that music could be incredibly helpful for the children there. I hadn't been aware before that point of how many children have limited lives and how many of those children aren't able to communicate verbally.
Yeah.
So it was a bit of an eye-opener for me. I mean, a children's hospice is a wonderful place. It sounds as though it shouldn't be, but it's amazing. And they're not there as places for children to die. They're there as places for children to live.
Yeah.
And children will go there for respite care over a number of years if they've been diagnosed with a degenerative condition that will take a while to play its course. It just seemed to me that music could be profoundly important for these children. Yeah. And then at that point, we heard that no music had ever been used in children's hospices in that way. There had been TVs and radios and CDs and people with guitars, but not used as a way for the children to communicate. So by a complete coincidence, that one of the nurses at the children's hospice where Jessie had been had taken time out to go and study to become a music therapist. She was already a musician. But she had no backing from the hospice other than the fact that she'd been allowed to go and study. They didn't really understand what she would be doing. And so I met with her, and to sort of between us, we educated that particular children's hospice about what music could do for the children. And so the first act of Jessie's Fund was to buy appropriate musical instruments for that hospice. So we spent, a couple of £1,000 or something. I didn't know Jessie's Fund would go much beyond that at the time, but it just grew and grew. And the first thing that happened was that it seemed to me really obvious that people could use the sort of instruments that we bought. So there would be metallophones and ocean drums and tom-toms and things that you and I, because we are familiar with music, would just know what to do with. You don't need to learn how to use them.
Of course.
And so it took me a little while to realise that actually these things were intimidating for people. People would not use them because they'd be scared of getting it wrong. And there isn't a wrong, but they'd be afraid of getting it wrong. So the first thing we did was devise a training course. The training course was designed for people who were not musicians at all, just to give them a few tricks in how to use music for communication. So we're starting from really small beginnings, buying some instruments, doing a bit of training. The next thing we did, I'm going to have to be a little bit shorter than the whole story, I think, because we're going to be here all night otherwise.
Yeah, it's been an incredible journey you guys have been on.
But the next thing we did was we started to establish posts for music therapists in children's hospices. Now, back in 1995, there were only 8 children's hospices in the UK. And children's hospices were invented in the UK. We were the first place in the world to have any. Now, there are over 50 children's hospices, so it's just grown like mad. So we did actually get music therapy in all those children's hospices in the first few years.
Amazing.
And over the years, not every children's hospice has wanted it. Some have been resistant, but the majority, I'd say 90%, have taken it on board through Jessie's Fund, really, through us just giving them the opportunity to experience the benefits without having to pay for it. because it's expensive.
Yeah,
It's an
definitely.
expensive thing.
Yeah.
So our because we're only a small charity, we knew that we couldn't sustain funding in
Right.
hospices or anywhere else in the long term.
Mm.
So what we did was we gave them 3 years music therapy. It was just a day a week, that's all we could afford, but a day a week of music therapy entirely funded by us, on condition that if they wanted to carry on with it the second year, they would fund half of it. And the third year, they'd fund 75. By the fourth year, they were self-sustaining. And it was a model that's really worked. So that was kind of job number one. And then we started to work in special schools, not music therapy, but interactive music making.
Right.
Started off in the first year of doing that with just 10 schools, and by now we've worked with a couple of hundred schools,
Crikey.
special schools, always special schools.
Yeah.
And then in the last 3 or 4 years, we've started to work with children's hospitals. It took 2 years to set up the first post.
Wow.
It took a long time.
Mm.
And then, of course, COVID came along. Nobody could go into
Yeah.
hospitals anymore. But that we're just picking up on that now. So two music therapists in different hospitals are this month about to start work in children's
Yeah.
hospitals that we're funding.
It's incredible, even in that very condensed version of the journey you guys have been on. I'm going to ask a difficult question now. What do you think has been your biggest achievement out of everything you've done as part of Jessie's Fund? What's been the one thing where you've been like, yes?
I think changing the culture in children's hospices, actually. So for the first few years, it was all about us going in there and saying, look what we can do. You know, you need a bit of a space for music. You need to have these instruments. We'll get them for you. We'll train up some of your care staff. And then what began to happen, as I said, there were only 8 to start off with. As hospices began to be built, they came to us. They said, how shall we design the music room? You know, can you advise us on what instruments we should get? And then can we have a staff choir? And suddenly children's hospices, you know, over the years, they became places where music was central to what they were doing, which it should be. It should be central to so many things.
Definitely.
And we know how much it makes a difference because to the psyche, because if it wouldn't, you wouldn't be going into Topshop or somewhere and having music at a certain pace and a certain type of music, which it encourages you to quickly want to buy things. There's been a lot of work researching what sort of music would make people buy things, for example.
Yeah, it's crazy the impact music has on the whole world now. But I'm sure for you it must have been phenomenal to think that you had such a large part to play in music becoming so central to hospices.
I suppose I haven't stopped to think about it in that way, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. But I imagine on the way, there was probably a lot of hurdles that you guys had to overcome. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the challenges that are centered around that sort of experience.
I suppose the very first challenge for me was that I was a clarinet player. I had no idea how to run a charity.
Of course.
I didn't even know that you took minutes at meetings. You know, I was completely innocent of any of that.
Mm.
So it was a massive learning curve because it was me that was running it. And I had to learn about the regulations, the charity commission, the policies that you have to have in place, how to fundraise, how to run a database. So it was the nitty gritty that was, you know, the big challenge at the beginning.
Mm.
Then as a small charity, and we've never had kind of different teams. We're just really small. There are 4 part-time people pulling this together, and our musicians who are freelance people that we contract to do different things. So we've never had a finance department. We've never had a fundraising department or a PR department. You know, I didn't know how to write a press release. So all those things were challenges. But in learning about them all, I kind of became a bit of a jack of all trades, I think. I'm probably a master of none, but sort of could do the graphic design for newsletters and write an annual report and so on. A challenge, and a big challenge for any charity, is raising money.
Yeah.
For us, competing against much bigger and much more experienced charities in applications for funds. But there are two sides of the coin. In being a small charity and very focused, some funders actually think this is quite exciting. We haven't heard of a charity like Jessie's Fund. So to some extent, it was to our advantage in the early years, but also because we come from a musical community, and a lot of people, if they're not professional musicians, are amateur musicians, and they really identify with what we do. Just actually about half an hour before we met here, I had an email from a musician who said that we might have remembered some donations we had a few months ago in memoriam of a music producer, quite a well-known one. He worked with a lot of on a lot of films. But this person had his wife, when he died, had wanted to find a musical charity that could be donated to in his memory.
Wow.
And through Chinese whispers, the charity that was mentioned was Jessie's Fund. And so that's, we have the musical community behind us, and it's made a massive difference. You could look at some challenges as opportunities as well, and I think that's what you need to do in life.
Yeah, definitely. And in the music industry, it is such a complex beast, as it were, for a lot of people, and it is so heavily about community and sharing your life experiences through music, I think. And it's beautiful that it's brought people to you, to unify people in for such a fantastic cause as well. I think is really incredible. Yeah, so I suppose the big question now is, how do you feel your work with young children that have learning difficulties and disabilities relates to and has an impact on the wider music industry as a whole? It's a big question.
I feel like it's more fundamental than how it has an impact on the music industry. I think it's more about how it has an impact on the world.
On the whole world, yeah.
Well, I just think that there's something there about equality and about the human right to communicate.
Of course.
And it goes beyond the music industry. It's more fundamental than that. If you go into any primary school, even now that funding for the arts has been so decimated, for the arts in education as well, has been so decimated, you'll hear singing. You'll hear at some point of the day there'll be some singing. How do you bring that sort of musical experience to children who can't speak? There has to be a way to do that. That has to be a normal thing for children who can't speak as well. And it is very easy to bring music to children who can't speak. And that will then impact on the industry as a whole.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it is all about education. It's all about earlier on in life. I don't think you can suddenly change the industry from the point of view of adults.
And do you feel the accessibility to music for those with disabilities and learning difficulties has improved, in your opinion?
Yes, I think it has. I think technology has made a difference. I think that there are campaigners who've made a massive difference, like Charles Hazelwood and his para orchestra, which it's amazing. It's a talented orchestra. It just happens that there are disabled people in it, but it's a talented orchestra, and they played at the 2012 London Olympics, and I think that was a bit of a turning point in people recognising that actually, there are disabled musicians. There are musicians who are not, completely the same as all other musicians. No person is completely the same as any other person.
No, exactly. Yeah.
There was a report that Youth Music, I think, commissioned, called Reshape Music, which said that 7%, only 7% of young people with disabilities were able to access musical education from their local music education hub, rather.
Yeah.
It's not a very high proportion, is it?
No.
And that 63% of music retailers were not aware that there are adapted musical instruments available.
Yeah,
So those things
shocking.
need to, so that's again, we go back to education.
Yeah, of course. And would you say that educating people is the way to make music more inclusive and accessible for these people?
Yes, I would say that it is. It's one of the ways
What would you
of
say the
making
others
music
are as well?
accessible. I think terminology is important, and when we talk about disabled people, you've probably never heard of it because it's a Radio 4 thing, and young people don't listen to Radio 4. But there's a program called Does He Take Sugar? And it's about disability, and it's the title refers to the fact that if people are walking along and you've got somebody pushing a wheelchair and you meet somebody who is just coming towards you and you have a cup of tea together, the person who is offering the cup of tea won't say to the disabled person, would you like sugar? That person will say to the non-disabled person, does
Yeah.
he take sugar? It's a terrible thing. It's a
Yeah.
terrible thing, and it's still there. So I think terminology, calling somebody disabled, might not be very helpful. We're all differently abled. We've all got different abilities.
Yeah.
I mean, I can play the clarinet, but I can't run a marathon. There might be somebody who can't talk but can compose amazing music. So I think we should talk about people being differently abled.
No, I completely agree. And how do you think that people can promote further diversity and inclusivity for music?
I think that technology is really useful. I mean, there's accessible technology, accessible musical instruments through the help of technology.
Yeah.
I mean, you can play fantastic music on the harp through an app.
Yeah.
You can play the guitar, you can play a drum kit. You can play drum kit by blinking your eyes.
Yeah.
Technology is amazing, but it's getting it more widely known.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think also there are the design things that can happen. For example, a lot of recording studios, the actual studio box is really quite small and quite difficult to negotiate in a wheelchair.
Yes. Having been in a fair few of them, I would definitely agree with that.
Very pokey. That needs to be changed. People need to be considered for their different needs and different abilities. The world should be made accessible for everybody.
Definitely. And I think for the individual watching this, for the one singular person, how can we enact change as people, do you think?
If we're talking about music students,
Yeah.
I think that quite a lot of music students will go into some aspect of education. We're back to education, aren't we? Sorry, I keep banging on about education.
Of course, it makes sense.
And I think that music students should all, as part of their learning, find out how to teach isn't quite the word, but how to use music with people with different abilities, so that a graduate who's just qualified as a school teacher goes into a mainstream school, and the mainstream school has probably got some children with autistic spectrum disorders and so on, that they are equipped to work with that. Yeah. So that those people are included. So it can be quite simple things, and it's all about lateral thinking.
Definitely, because you think about that, and that is the inclusivity and the equality that you'd sort of just expect to see, but it's shocking that it's not as common as it should be.
Exactly, but I also think that that it's making normal what is considered abnormal. If you've got a mainstream school that's got a child that's got some disabilities in it, and that child is involved in everything else, made welcome in everything else, then the children who have not got the disabilities, or let's call them different abilities, see this as a normal thing, that person is doing the same thing as them, and they might be helping them to do it. But at the same time, that person who's got different abilities is helping the more normal ability person to understand from a different point of view how the world is.
Yeah.
I think it goes two ways. I think we, we have to not be patronizing.
Of course. My one big question to kind of summarize all of this is what would you say would be the main takeaway, like for people going out now and approaching their lives and encountering people that are differently able to themselves? What is the one thing that they need to keep in mind that whole time?
Communicate with them. If they can't communicate the way you would normally communicate, find out the best way for them to communicate and do that with them.
Yeah.
It might be through touch. It might be through the way you use your eyes. It could be anything. It could be through movement. It could be through music.
Exactly.
We have got, and for your students, we've got on our website, I don't know if you noticed them, we've got a resources section, which has got quite a lot of ideas for things that you could do in music with children who've got different needs.
Yes, and I will make sure to link all of these resources and useful things for our students in the little description section when this goes up on YouTube, and we'll make sure to promote as much as we can, because I think this is really important, and that's part of the reason we started this series. Is people have these awareness of these areas within music that aren't necessarily mainstream or covered as widely as we feel they should be, and that is why it's so phenomenal that you've sat down with me today and had this conversation.
As a musician, I've never given up being the performer. So, I run Jessie's Fund with about 90% of my time, but I'm still playing. And I think as a musician, I have so much more insight and ability to express what music is trying to express, or what music is able to express. I can match that much more since my perception of what music is has changed through the work that Jessie's Fund has done. So I think that for young musicians, it should really enrich. Even if they want to be on the concert platform and think this is not relevant for them, it really enriches your musicianship.
Yeah, it's looking at it from a whole new perspective, really, and it's that level of equality again and inclusivity. It just broadens your horizons so much, thinking about life so differently. And it shouldn't be different. I think that's the main takeaway from this is, working with those that are differently able to yourself shouldn't be seen as different. It's just life.
It's just not being tunnel visioned, actually. It's just seeing more and understanding more and learning more.
Exactly. I think it's really inspiring what you've done, and I'm so grateful that you've taken the time to talk to me so we can put this video together and just kind of keep informing people and keep educating people.